Double 800-meter Olympic champion Caster Semenya has won a partial victory today at the European Court of Human Rights in her long legal battle over athletic sex eligibility rules. Well, the court ruled that the South African athlete had some of her rights to a fair hearing violated at Switzerland's Supreme Court, where she had appealed against a ruling by the Court of Arbitration for Sport regarding some of the World Athletics regulations. However, the court failed to pronounce itself on the question of Semenya's being discriminated against in Swiss courts. Semenya's case could now go back to the Swiss Federal Court in Lausanne. Semenya was born with differences of sexual development and has been unable to compete in the 800 meters since World Athletics brought in rules in 2019 restricting testosterone levels for certain track events.
Hi guys, welcome back to the channel. So Caster Semenya had a victory in court recently. The European Court of Human Rights ruled that Semenya did not receive a fair trial in some recent appeals. Semenya appealed the World Athletics regulations that were introduced in 2019 that made it a requirement for intersex athletes to suppress their testosterone to a significant amount, especially for certain events that were under a mile, I believe. And Semenya argued that this was discrimination. This is an athlete that has always been presented, as far as I'm aware, as a woman who just simply has high testosterone. I remember buying into that narrative for many, many years. Even when I started this channel, I remember mentioning Semenya and speaking about how some women are discriminated against because they just happen to have high testosterone, whereas male athletes who identify as trans are allowed to compete in the women's category. So even up until recently, I bought into that lie, basically. The fact is, Caster Semenya is male. Caster Semenya has a disorder that only affects males, when all this time, this person has been competing in the women's category, in a category that is by definition supposed to exclude male athletes. This is not a woman with high testosterone. That is not a thing. Women have testosterone within a certain range. Even the higher range is way below that of a male. Nowhere near the levels that men have. 2.4 nanomoles, I believe, is within the higher range.
Well, if they have the condition that Caster Semenya has, and we know about that because of Semenya taking it to the courts and everything was published, then they would be babies who were thought to be girls or who had ambiguous genitals when they were born, registered as girls, but would have gone through a full male puberty. And at that point, all would have become clear.
There's a lot of confusion in the reporting around this. Obviously, there have been some cases in the past where women born as women have naturally high testosterone levels, and sometimes there have been cases where it's transgender women. Do we know which it is in this case?
It's never about naturally high testosterone levels in women. When they talk about females with these high testosterone levels, they're really talking about males with disorders of sex development. And in some cases, rarely happens in developed countries, but in some cases, babies born with these disorders are wrongly labeled as female, and then they grow up and go through male puberty, and everyone then knows they're male. This is well documented now, for example, with Caster Semenya, that they have internal testes, they produce testosterone, they go through puberty, they have all those advantages.
This whole time, when they were referring to women with high testosterone, they were talking about male athletes. This is what we're dealing with here. So much so that in 2016, there was an all-male podium. That's why a lot of pressure was put on World Athletics. There were women who were coming forward, female athletes coming forward saying that this isn't fair.
The public can see as well, sorry, just how difficult it is with the change of rule, but all we can do is give it our best.
I think it challenges and threatens the integrity of women's sports to have intersex athletes competing against genetic women. I think Caster's a wonderful person. I have nothing against her, but I think we already have an established precedent of men's sports and women's sports, and I think we need to honor that. Women have fought far too long to be able to even have the right to compete, and now it's being challenged by intersex and trans athletes, and I don't think that's right.
Some of them were ostracized and accused of being bigots, accused of being racists. Even the changes introduced in 2019 was simply not enough. it still allowed male athletes to compete in the women's category. It still allowed male athletes who had an advantage over women, even with suppressing their testosterone, to compete in the women's category. And as we know today, World Athletics have now updated their policy to exclude male athletes altogether. Perhaps these court cases is what inspired them to actually update their policy real quick, because Caster Semenya, it's been ruled, didn't get a fair trial. So technically, this person can now fight to compete in the women's category. So it all started in the Court of Arbitration for Sport in Switzerland, and then there was an appeal. Caster Semenya continued to fight these eligibility rules. It went to the Swiss Supreme Court. They still ruled against Semenya, but then the appeal went all the way to the European Court of Human Rights. That court has now decided that they're going to have to look into it again. So that it's now going back to the Supreme Court. So we shall see where it leads. Now, I don't think there's any need for panic. World Athletics have updated their policy saying that if you are male, you cannot compete in the women's category, and they're even doing gender tests to ensure that the female category is maintained, that the integrity of the female category is not compromised. And Semenya has also said that it's not really about trying to get back into the women's category, because I do believe Semenya is well aware that it's a long shot, that it's basically not going to happen now. But I believe Semenya wanted there to be some acknowledgement from the courts that there was some discrimination in regards to treatment, in regards to how World Athletics handled the situation, perhaps.
It doesn't mean that she can compete again, but what it does do is that it puts more pressure on sports bodies to be more circumspect when they're setting regulations, and to have at the heart of those regulations making sure that they don't violate human rights. Now, this is something that Caster Semenya herself has said she sees as a win, because the case for her was not about returning to the track, but was more about making sure that her dignity is respected, that her rights are protected, but also the rights of other athletes who have the same condition that she has. And she has consistently said over the years that she's being unfairly discriminated against over a condition she's got no control over. She was born with this condition. She has been described as intersex, and that means she's got higher testosterone levels than other women. But she's said, apart from that, she's done nothing wrong, and she feels like for years she's been punished for the way that, quote, God had created her.
So that's at the heart of the issue. It's about how one is treated, how athletes with disorders of sex development, how intersex athletes are treated. However, again, when one is intersex, you are still either male or female. There are females born with abnormalities as well, but they are still female. This is not what we're talking about when we are referring to Caster Semenya. Caster Semenya is male. All of that came out during these court cases because medical information was released. Caster obviously is very similar to Imran Khalif. We are talking about male athletes who slipped through the net and were able to compete as women, as females, when they are not. Even women who have PCOS, where their testosterone may be within the higher range, it's still within the range that females produce. Not way outside of that range. That is not a thing. But we were conditioned, I believe, to see the likes of Caster Semenya in that light. And that's simply not in line with biology. That's not how it works. Even intersex people are either male or female. But yes, intersex people are still entitled to dignity, respect. Caster Semenya claims to have been treated like a guinea pig when it comes to undergoing certain testing. I do believe there was a lack of knowledge about DSD, perhaps, especially in other countries. I mean, that's why a lot of these male athletes were classed as female to begin with. And if you are a male competing in the women's category, that is disenfranchising female athletes. Sebastian Coe, he said that there were about 13 athletes at the moment who are going to be affected by these eligibility rules. That is a lot of women who are going to be disenfranchised by these 13 athletes. And that cannot continue under any circumstances. Otherwise, there is no female category. We've seen the upheaval caused in the 2016 Olympics. It was devastating to see the effect it had on these female athletes. That, again, cannot continue. The report commissioned by the UN again highlighted how female athletes have lost out on up to 900 medals. So I'm glad World Athletics are now introducing gender testing or sex screening to determine whether one is male or female in order to be eligible to compete in the female category. And we're hoping that the Olympic Committee will follow suit. We wouldn't be talking about this today. We wouldn't have seen what we've seen over the years, the injustice against women, if the Olympic Committee had kept the sex screening, if they hadn't have got rid of it. So we need to get back to protecting the women's category, the female category. And at the very least, it must be a requirement that one should be female in order to compete.
When she came out as a teenager who came back home in South Africa and was celebrated for winning a gold medal at the Olympics, and how quickly that joy was stripped from her. She has been media shy for years, only rarely communicating with the media. But I remember a time when I went to go visit the village where she was from in Polokwane, and her community was just stunned. They couldn't make sense of what was happening. At the time, they were saying they feel that she's being discriminated against. The sex tests that she'd been subjected to were the first they'd ever heard of such a thing. Even the word intersex they'd never heard of. Caster herself didn't know she had this condition until she was subjected to those tests. So a lot of people over the years have said this is a young woman who had been robbed of a chance to enjoy her victory.
Now, you heard there, Semenya is claiming not to have known about this condition, and that does happen. But even those who are intersex, they go through male puberty. And that's when they become aware.
There's no such thing in life. If you want to get rid of a human being, you go tell them straight, I want to get rid of you, instead of going around collecting data on how, their body or their physique, their performance, Probably there's something, adventurous or something, or probably because they say I have advantage, in high testosterone. Of course, I do have it. So what?
The medical terms, what they tell me, my testosterone, being born, without the uterus, being born with internal testicles, those don't make me less a woman. It's just the differences that I was born with, and I embrace them.
They're not going to start menstruating. So they go to the doctor and they're like, what's up with this? I've never got my period. And that's when they find out that they are male. And of course, that must be devastating. Now, we can have compassion for these athletes without disenfranchising female athletes, without destroying the careers of female athletes or jeopardizing the safety of female athletes, like what we saw at the Paris Olympics. That is unacceptable. Compassion for intersex athletes shouldn't mean that you trample upon the rights of female athletes, of women. That is not acceptable under any circumstances, and there's no justification for that, especially under the guise of being compassionate towards intersex athletes. So we shall see how this develops. Is Caster Semenya going to pursue it any further? Is Caster going to appeal again? We shall see. The court said it could not uphold an earlier finding by a lower chamber that Semenya had been the victim of discrimination, deeming the complaints inadmissible as they did not fall under Switzerland's jurisdiction. But it handed Semenya a partial victory in finding that the case required a rigorous judicial review, as there were serious personal rights at risk, and the Swiss Federal Court's review had fallen short of that requirement. It ordered Switzerland to pay the athlete €80,000 of expenses. The decision paves the way for the case to be sent back to the Swiss Federal Court in Lausanne for reconsideration. On Thursday, Semenya welcomed the European Court's decision, describing it as great for me, great for athletes. Semenya spoke to reporters outside the court and said, "We need to respect athletes. We need to put their rights first," said the 34-year-old. So I don't think there's any need to panic. I don't think this means that Semenya can now compete in the women's category, in the LA Olympics, for example. I don't think that's going to happen. I don't think that's something that female athletes have to worry about. But their rights certainly need to be respected. Their rights to fair and safe sports needs to be respected. And I wonder what would happen if the female athletes filed some lawsuits in the Swiss courts as they deal with the Olympics. I wonder what would happen. What would be the outcome of that? If they were to do that, I wouldn't blame them one bit, especially the women who have lost out on medals and championships over the years, whose records have gone to male athletes. Maybe we will see some lawsuits from them. Who knows? So let me know what you think. Thanks for watching. Like, comment and subscribe. Take care of yourselves, and God willing, I will see you in the next video.